Excited for this panel because we've gathered together three panelists that are diverse, but are going to help us kind of think through both some of the environmental issues and their interrelationship with some of the previous panels that we've had today. We're joined, starting from my far right, by Professor Jessica Meeuwig, who's the director of the Center for Marine Futures at UWA. In 2012, she was the Conservation Fellow for the Zoological Society of London and was ranked by the Western Australian as one of the top 100 most influential West Australians. And she's going to explain a little bit more, because actually I'm one of these guys who reads the words, but I don't quite understand what it said. She focuses on the ecology of reefs and open ocean shark and fish assemblages. And I'm not quite sure what the assemblages part means, but I'm sure we'll find out very soon. Then to her left, and to the second to my right, is Dr. Tony Worby, who's director of the CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere Division. He's based in Hobart, Tasmania, and I love to exalt how wonderful the clean air here is in Western Australia, but apparently we have a rival in Tasmania, and he'll be sharing with us his insights from his position at CSIRO. And then last and certainly not least, we're directed by Mr. John Garnaut, who's a former Asia-Pacific editor for Fairfax Media and just finished a stint as a senior media advisor to the Prime Minister. And I wanted to start off, if I could, with some initial questions just to kind of kick off the discussion. And then we'll have a broader opportunity for a discussion among the panel. And if I could start with you, Jessica. You've been an articulate advocate for the creation of maritime parks. I understand that marine life doesn't recognize national borders. And interesting, a lot of the discussions we showed here showed a lack of national borders, just flow of oceans. What type of cooperation do you think is necessary on a regional basis in the zone to protect both fisheries and assemblages, once you tell me what that is?
So an assemblage is basically like a village. So you have a diversity of people, a diversity of animals. So when we go out into the big blue, into our open ocean systems, we've got a wide range of sharks, we've got tunas. Those are the things that we tend to fish, but they're also all the other small components of the ecosystem. So that's what we talk about, a fish assemblage. And the reality is that we've basically trashed our oceans. We have 40% of our tunas left from 50 years ago when I was born, and sharks for some species are down to 5 to 10% of the abundance a mere 50 years ago. So where we need to go, I think, through regional cooperation is recognizing that to halt and reverse the declines in our ocean wildlife, we need marine parks. Fisheries management is a dark art that varies in its effectiveness, and certainly on the high seas, it's been very ineffective. So in order to get marine parks up, we need to have not just an Australian approach to this, but a whole Indian Ocean basin. And I think one of the key things that we can do is also close the high seas to fishing. What we know is that, well, there's very good data suggesting that if we actually close the high seas to fishing, we'll have better control, have less labor abuses, and more fish that will flow into national boundaries. So that's where the cooperation needs to come.
Thank you. Appreciate that. If I could move next to you then, Tony. The CSIRO engages in a broad range of research, with a lot of direct relevance to this conference itself. Could you kind of outline for us some of your ongoing efforts, particularly those that are kind of related to the zone as we're looking at it today?
Yeah, sure. I guess in keeping with the theme of the blue economy, one of CSIRO's main pillars for investment really is the sustainable development of the blue economy. And so that pillar in our strategy really guides a lot of the investments that we make in our in what we fund in terms of research and where our research priorities lay. And it also guides a lot of our collaboration, both nationally and internationally. And since the Foreign Minister chose this venue this morning to announce $500,000 of additional funding to CSIRO, it's perhaps just worth mentioning in this forum as well that that really does underpin a lot of the work that we're doing in the blue zone with other Indian Ocean countries, and particularly focused on blue carbon. Blue carbon is really, in the context of what was announced this morning, really a climate mitigation measure. It's a way of using blue carbon to count into the inventory of our carbon reporting globally. But of course, seagrasses and mangroves are all critically important for ecosystem health. for the value of the ecosystem services that Paul Hardesty just spoke about, and supporting a lot of livelihoods as well in communities that depend heavily on fishing. And an earlier speaker talked about some of the impacts that can happen when people lose their livelihoods of fishing, and perhaps one of the things we'll talk a little bit more about in this discussion is IUU fishing as well, because we're doing quite a lot of work in that space. But I think, very broadly based, we're doing an enormous amount of work in the Indian Ocean region, both in the blue carbon space, but also lots of ocean observing. IMOS has been mentioned several times, and in the context of climate change, we're doing a lot in that space as well.
Well, thank you. John, if I could turn to you as both a journalist and in government, you've covered a broad range of issues. And normally, in fact, even including this conference itself, we tend to separate security and the environment in two different realms altogether. Would you address kind of the interplay between the two of those? And I understand you might have some slides. Is that correct?
If we need them, yeah, sure.
Well, there they are. Apparently so, they came up.
Yeah, look, I think today's been the answer's been clear all day, and that is probably for most of my lifetime, you could be a policy maker in the national security world, or the economic world, or a business person, or in the ecological, scientific world, and you could kind of pretend that your worlds didn't have to intersect. Now, today, I think presentation after presentation has at least bumped up against the fact that all three systems rest on the same foundation, and that foundation is institutional. That if you don't have an independently applied, impartial system of rules, of laws, then it's very difficult to build anything at all. It's very hard to have ecologically sustainable systems if you don't have a legal framework, if you don't have transparency, if you don't have an independent arbiter to apply those rules. Same for business. We know if you don't have clear property rights. We're hearing from David this morning at Austral Fisheries that extraordinarily sophisticated scientific and economic kind of foundation that you've built on the basis of your proprietary rights you have over those fisheries down at in the southern waters there. And it's the same with national security. I think we're discovering now that they are sort of more under threat than they have been before, that it's very hard to have strategic stability if you don't have clearly defined laws that are applied to all parties. So that's it. We're all talking about the same issue from very different angles, and that is the rule of law.
Thank you. Well, let me go back and ask the panel as a whole. It's a difficult thing being towards the end of the afternoon because a lot of the issues that you've discussed have come up in one form or the other. But we've got someone from academia who's working directly in that. We've got someone from CSIRO, someone from journalism. I'm kind of curious, if you would take the many issues we discussed today, particularly in the context of the marine environment, and were to try to identify the most troubling trend or development to you personally. Not an attempt to kind of prioritize it globally, but for you personally, what do you think that we ought to be paying more attention to right now that you would prioritize? We'll start with you, then work our way back.
Look, I don't know if you had that. If you're able to flick over to the next slide, whoever the slide person is. But we talked about, a lot about the Hague Tribunal ruling, and one of the tangential outcomes of that was a very clear ruling on what's happening in the ecological space in the South China Sea. If you're building 3-kilometre runways on what used to be pristine coral reefs, it's obviously mass destruction of a very fragile ecological environment. So multiplied 4 or 5 times across the Spratlys, we're starting to talk about real environmental problems. I think, Richard, you were talking about an ecological wasteland in the north of the South China Sea area, and how that wasteland is now pushing south. And so the fact that there is contestability over this resource security, who's responsible, what rules should be applied, is actually pushing an ecological disaster all the way through Southeast Asia. So I think the Hague Tribunal ruling is of enormous substantive value, but also symbolic value, because if we are calling into question the very cornerstone of international law, the UNCLOS system, then really, what hope have we got for building more kind of delicate legal arrangements?
Well, thank you. Tony?
So I'll come back to something that the Premier mentioned this morning, which is the scourge of plastic in our oceans. It's been mentioned a couple of times today. But, you know, the ocean produces absolutely no plastic, and yet about 8 million tonnes, that's a conservative estimate based on some modelling that we've done at CSIRO, 8 million tonnes of plastic ends up in the ocean every year. And to break that down by day, it's more than 20,000 tonnes of plastic going into the ocean every year. So just imagine the dump trucks lined up on the beaches of Perth dumping that in. There'd be absolute outrage if you went down and witnessed that. And yet globally, this is what we're all responsible for. And I have to say, turning up today, I was delighted that there's real glasses and real jugs of water on the table, so well done to this venue. But how often do we turn up and an audience like this might go through several thousand bottles of water, just us alone. So it is an enormous problem. Some of the work that we're doing, again, with Indian Ocean rim countries and with support from DFAT, is to do some of the modelling that looks at how how plastics make their way from their source on land through our waterways and into our oceans, and then once they are in our oceans, actually where they then drift to and what impacts they have. And the impacts are enormous. They're on our wildlife, obviously. I think many of us have seen, but are perhaps becoming somewhat immune to seeing images of animals that have got a plastic ring stuck around their neck, or the guts of a fish or a whale that's died being spilled onto the beach, and seeing just all of the plastics there. I think, you know, we're horrified when we see that, but I think we're also becoming a little bit immune to it. And I think we need to really reflect on the scourge that that's having on our environment. We're doing a lot of work, as I said, with Indian Ocean rim countries to train people to go onto the beaches, to make assessments of the plastic that is found there, to actually identify baselines so that when the advocacy and the policy changes happen, and they are starting to happen, that we can actually determine whether there are measurable impacts as a result of the policy changes. And I'll just close by citing one more recent piece of research that's just come out, which does state that in areas where there is a deposit scheme around the world on disposable bottles, there's a statistically significant, or there are statistically significant less marine debris on the beaches associated with those areas.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Meeuwig.
So I think for me, we've heard a lot about the blue economy, and I think it's important to understand that not all components of the blue economy are equally dependent on healthy oceans. So for instance, for transport and shipping, it doesn't really matter as long as you've got a pond to move across what the actual quality of that environment is. But for food security, we just can't lose sight of the track of the challenges that we're going to face in the Indian Ocean in terms of food security. We have pressure from Mauritius to have the British Indian Ocean Territory returned to it. That's about fish wars. That's about their oceans being empty and needing to find fish somewhere else. We've heard it referenced with the South China Sea, that there are also fishery reasons why people want access to those resources. And if you think then that that's actually tied to environmental refugees, we will see an increase in people engaging in piracy, in illegal fishing, because they don't have choices left in their own national waters. And I think understanding when we talk about the blue economy, that component, food production, requires healthy oceans. And I think that's why I come back to the importance of marine protected areas as building resilient oceans that actually service our blue economy. And tied to that, I just want to comment too that I think the other thing we need to not lose sight of is the importance of regional leadership. So it's with some concern that I note that Australia is busy winding back its ocean protection rather than showing leadership within the region.
Let me pick up on that final point in terms of leadership within the region. One theme that I would hope that everybody in the room is taking away from this day is that, you know, the borders really don't apply an awful lot in maritime space. Every one of these computer models that we saw that showed the flows of ocean currents or the movement of ships in the free space, it gives you a sense that this is obviously an issue, and you've probably heard this from almost every speaker, that any one country can't solve alone. The oceans are almost the very definition of the global commons. So in that context, what are the regional collaborative or cooperative efforts that are happening that we ought to be aware of and that we ought to encourage, that are kind of positive signs where countries or intra-regional or kind of extra-regional kind of groups are coming together to work on issues, particularly those that you care about? Jessica, we'll start with you.
Well, so the main one I'm aware of is through IORA, and then there's regional.
And IORA is?
The Indian Ocean Rim Association, which Minister Bishop has been very effective in. There are regional fisheries management authorities. Jury's out. But I think where one of our big gaps is we're not working together on marine protected areas regionally. We should be taking a strategic approach about saying where are the best places to put these things? How do we assist countries who have less capacity to enforce? Eyes in the Sky will start helping with that. But that's where some regional cooperation could happen so that we're supporting each other in establishing protected areas.
Thank you. Tony?
And perhaps pick up a little bit on that. I mentioned IUU fishing before, and it's been mentioned by a few speakers today. Where we CSIRO are working closely with Indonesia in particular at the moment, because if you look at the impacts of IUU fishing, they're potentially anywhere between 10 and 20% of the total take. And when you consider that about 80% of the world's fish stocks are either at capacity or already overfished, there's very little capacity for illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing in terms of the impact that it's likely to have on those fish stocks. So, but one of the challenges for fisheries managers and regulators is the cost of enforcement. And so you can get very expensive satellite images ordered through different space agencies, but it's quite often beyond the reach of a fisheries management authority. So we've been working with freely available satellite data, radar data. We've also been working with some of the automatic positioning data that comes from vessels to actually look at ships' tracks and then to identify the kind of behaviours in the positioning that would lead you to make an assessment that perhaps they're operating a little bit strangely. So sometimes fishing vessels will pretend that they're cargo vessels by scooting through a shipping lane, for example, but they'll either turn off their beacon, which in itself is a suspicious activity, so they'll go dark effectively, or they'll engage in some kind of track that you can determine to be perhaps a little bit suspicious and representative of illegal fishing activity. You can then provide that information to port authorities, to fisheries regulators, to give them the information that there are vessels or a particular vessel in their area that's behaving suspiciously, and then they then have the opportunity to intercept that vessel as it comes into port. And so I think this is actually really starting to pay dividends in Indonesia in particular. The estimate to the Indonesian economy of IUU fishing is in excess of $2 billion a year. And so, from that perspective, I think that's the kind of international cooperation that's really paying some dividends.
John?
Just quickly, in a similar direction, I think we're seeing a movement towards a higher level cooperation on states that share similar interests in the maritime domain awareness space. And so particularly like South Pacific nations and Southeast Asian nations that don't have sophisticated radar capabilities, that is an area where countries like Australia, even New Zealand, Japan and others can really help to provide sort of almost like a regional surveillance infrastructure for maritime fisheries issues, smuggling issues, and other related law and order questions.
So I wonder if I could tie those first two questions together and then ask you kind of a basic inclination kind of question. If you're like me, you recognize there's a bit of a tension here in much of our discussion today. On the one hand, there's a lot of really concerning developments that are happening in terms of the fisheries and the numbers and the stocks and the conflicts and the activities by individuals. On the other hand, there's some things that are relatively positive, right? The increase of transparency, the work of individuals who are trying to push it. So there's a tension there. Now, as someone who is relatively new to the issues that we've been discussing for this day and Maritime's issues, you can take that same tension and put it very broadly in the geopolitical sphere, right? I mean, if you think about it, for the younger students here who have known nothing but the post-Cold War era, it probably doesn't apply. But for the few others out here that have gray in the hair, you probably, like me, went through a period of time where you couldn't imagine the end of the Cold War. It was inconceivable. Right? That was how that defined everything, and everything from fisheries was all done in the context of how the world was divided up. And then we went through a 25-year period of time when we, maybe naively believed that we were moving inexorably towards kind of Star Trek, right? Where it's going to be ever-increasing globalization, internationalization. We were going to work together. We were going to be ever collaborative. Yet in the last few years, there's been some really disturbing trends. So given the fact that global infrastructure kind of sits on the top of our abilities to work across with other nations or in the zone. This is my question, and again, it's a tough question, but are you...
Start on that end.
Are you basically optimistic? Yeah? Are you optimistic about the directions we're going? And if not, kind of what would it take what would you like to see happen to change you in a more optimistic direction?
So I get that one. So, look, optimistic would be the wrong word. I think we cannot really overstate the challenges to the system that we've just suddenly had to confront in the last couple of years. Whether or not the outcome is positive really depends on all of us. So there is no necessary reason why the kind of the rise of authoritarianism, the breakdown of democracy, the democratic system, there's no necessary reasons why those forces will have to prevail at all. But really, they will if we just stand by and let it happen. And this is not just a security domain question. It's certainly not just a military domain question. It's for the whole breadth of civil society. The way that NGOs are responding to their kind of response systems aren't working as well to authoritarian markets and producers as they do to democratic systems. We talked about the fabulous investigative journalism that I think Marjorie did at AP and showed us this afternoon. That depended on being able to hold producers accountable and retailers accountable in very sophisticated, open, transparent markets in the United States. Those systems don't work so well with closed, non-transparent systems. The NGOs are proving to be much less effective in holding authoritarian states and states where the rule of law is weak accountable. So it's not just governments that need to respond and respond decisively, but really the full gamut of civil society. So I think the jury's still out. It doesn't look very good, but I'm not feeling pessimistic yet.
Where do you come down the side of the ledger, Tony?
So I'm usually asked this question in the context of climate science because I'm a climate scientist by training, and of course, it would be easy to be pessimistic as a climate scientist in some of the current landscape. But I think as researchers, we have to remain optimistic. We have to remain as impartial as we can, and we have to rely on our credibility as seekers of the truth, and particularly at times where there's a lot of political uncertainty and there's the broader global uncertainty that you talk about. Because I think at the end of the day, the thing that's going to most help us navigate some of our challenges is having a deep understanding of the world we live in, how it works, and relying on scientific credibility and data to work through some of our challenges. So I'm not naively optimistic, but I truly believe that as a scientist, I have to remain optimistic and credible. So.
Thank you. Jessica.
So conservation biologists as a profession have the highest rates of depression amongst most science communities, right? And I once asked Daniel Pauly, who's perhaps one of the best thinkers about oceans on the planet and fisheries. He's always so cheerful. He tells you how the oceans are dying with a smile on his face. Anyway, I said, Daniel, how do you stay so positive? And he said, well, I'm not trying to fix the problems. I'm just trying to make it less bad. And by that, he meant buying time. And so one of the things that makes me optimistic is seeing all the young people who are here. When I studied marine biology, nobody wanted to be a marine scientist. There's very few of us. But now I see much greater transparency, much more engagement and capacity to do marine science. It's cool, it's exciting, and hopefully we hold on to the hope, we hold on to chasing the numbers and speaking truth to power about the state of our oceans, and it will get better, has to.
If I can venture kind of an answer myself, a lot of these things we've seen today are on the one level emotionally striking. When you see the human level, when you see the bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, it is shocking. On the other hand, there's activities you see that are encouraging. I would highlight one thing that most of you didn't see, and this is particularly of interest to the students who are in the audience. Yesterday afternoon, our international visitors had an opportunity to visit the Indian Ocean Marine Research Centre at the University of Western Australia and the Oceans Institute there. And we had a full afternoon tour of the facilities, which was itself impressive. But what was really impressive was over the course of the last half hour or so, a series of 7 or 8 short, pithy presentations by PhD candidates, doctoral candidates at the school, and the work that they were doing. And you couldn't come out of that meeting and not be optimistic. It's because of the energy and drive. And so again, I share Jessica's idea that there is great hope in the rising generation. We're delighted to have them here in the room today. I've got a question from the audience. Is the only real solution to become vegan? Is sustainable fishing a contradiction in terms given population pressures? And this is from Robin McClellan.
No, you don't have to become a vegan. I think we have to make better choices about what we choose to eat. So eating at the top of the food chain, tuna, sharks, is inappropriate, I would say. But if we take lessons from our neighbors in the region, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, where there's much greater engagement with species of fish that are at the bottom of the food chain that are much more efficient. So there are good choices that we can make. But, and you alluded to it, the big elephant in the room, or should I say whale in the swimming pool, we're not talking about population growth. And with the US having re-implemented the Mexico City policy that restricts aid funding when people have access to family planning, that issue still needs to be addressed. How do we assist, particularly around the Indian Ocean, to get a better handle on population growth? Or we'll all be eating spirulina.
Thank you. Actually, my burning question was, what does spirulina taste like? But that's a question for another day. The next question is, I think, very much appropriate for you, John, from Fred Cheney. What are the common objectives, cooperation opportunities with China in relation to the contested ocean areas like the South China Sea?
That's a really tough one because it's not clear that there are many at all. So what we're seeing, I think, in the South China Sea is partly an exporting of domestic politics into the region. And so if this is a political system in China at the moment, which is kind of explicitly above laws, where civil society is seen as a threat within China, then we're actually seeing the extension of those principles into the regional domain. So it may be the case that there is no very neat crossover of common interests in the South China Sea. The best we may be able to hope for is an equilibrium, a balance of forces, of resistance, of imposing sufficient legitimacy costs, and hopefully not more than that, for behaviour which is seen to be in breach of universally understood principles and rules. But I don't see an easy equilibrium anytime soon in the South China Sea.
Tony, if I could go back to you, you hinted at several areas where CSIRO is collaborating and doing cooperative research kind of in the region. Given the fact that much of our discussion today vis-a-vis China has been about that kind of geostrategic kind of tension and pushing, can you kind of highlight some of the areas where CSIRO is kind of collaborating and working together, not just with China, but with others in the region that we ought to be paying attention to?
Well, there's lots. So CSIRO's recently entered into a very significant relationship with the Chinese in relation to Southern Hemisphere ocean research. So that's a new centre that's based in Hobart. It's a major collaboration with Qingdao National Marine Laboratory. So one of the earlier maps that was shown here showed the port of Qingdao in China, which historically has been a very important seaport for China. It's the focus of a lot of their marine research. So Ocean University China is based there, along with various oceanographic institutions. They're partnering with us, as well as the University of Tasmania and the University of New South Wales, to look at how not only the Southern Ocean is changing, but how some of the equatorial oceans that affect weather and climate patterns for both of our countries are changing. So significant investments in ocean observing, significant opportunities for joint research in that area. And I guess kind of a long-term commitment to partnering in that space. So there are some really active new opportunities that we've taken advantage of. To come back to the ocean observing system, the global ocean observing system's been discussed a number of times today. It is something that can only be done through international collaboration. The Argo program, for those of you who don't know, is a program of about 6,000 or 7,000 floats all through the world's oceans now. They drift along at about 1,000 metres depth, and once a month they drop down to 2,000 metres depth. They measure all the way up to the surface and they transmit their data. And that has absolutely revolutionised ocean observing. It underpins a lot of our ocean modelling capability and ocean forecasting capability that we deliver to the Australian Defence Forces. But that observing program, supported in Australia through NCRIS and the Integrated Marine Observing System, could only be done through co-investment from lots of countries, including our near neighbours and those further afield. So lots of examples.
Well, I was talking earlier about tensions. I have a lot of questions I want to keep asking this incredible panel, but I've also got the tension of being the organizer and wanting to get back on time. And so with that, I'd like to ask each and every one of you to join me in thanking our panel for their remarks today.